The sun clung low to the horizon, spilling a molten glow across the endless stretch of desert. Heat shimmered over the dunes like a living creature, distorting the world into a wavering mirage. Rajveer wiped the sweat from his brow and squinted ahead. His jeep, once humming with confidence, now sat stubbornly silent on the cracked dirt road, the engine coughing its last breath an hour earlier. He had underestimated the desert's vastness, believing a single road map and a half-full tank would be enough to explore Saudi Arabia's untouched landscapes. Now, with the wind growing harsher and daylight fading, his confidence thinned into a sharp thread of unease. He stepped out, the soles of his shoes sinking slightly into the scorching sand, and scanned the barren expanse. There was no sign of movement, no caravans, no passing vehicles, not even the distant silhouette of a settlement. His phone, drained of signal, displayed only the mocking bars of emptiness. For the first time since he'd landed in this country, Rajveer felt truly alone. The silence was so absolute it pressed against his ears, amplifying the distant hiss of shifting dunes. He thought briefly of turning back on foot, retracing the road until he reached some outpost, but the idea of wandering aimlessly beneath a sky that would soon darken was just as reckless. The decision was made for him by a sound, faint, almost drowned by the wind. It was not mechanical or animal. It was human. A high, fragile sound, like someone calling out through clenched teeth. Rajveer froze, straining to listen. Again it came, this time sharper, tinged with panic. Without thinking, he grabbed his water bottle and began moving toward it, each step kicking up little puffs of sand that the wind quickly erased. He wasn't sure if this was courage or foolishness, but anything was better than standing idle beside a dead jeep in an empty desert. The sound led him to a cluster of jagged rocks rising abruptly from the dunes, a forgotten ruin that might once have been a watch post. As he approached, he noticed movement in the shadows between the stones. 5 figures huddled close together, their clothing blending with the muted colors of the landscape. They were girls, young, between their mid-teens and early 20s, dressed in long dusty abayas that clung to their forms like worn cloaks. Their eyes caught the light first, wide, watchful, frightened. Rajveer slowed his pace and raised both hands, palms open to show he meant no harm. They tensed as if ready to scatter, like startled birds, but one girl stepped slightly forward. Her face was smeared with sand, her lips cracked, and when she spoke, the words were Arabic. Rapid, urgent, almost desperate. He shook his head, helpless, then pointed to his water bottle and extended it toward them. Hunger and exhaustion warred visibly with their fear. Finally, the girl who had spoken took the bottle, lifted it carefully and passed it around. Each drank in turn, cautious but ravenous, as if they hadn't tasted water in hours. Up close, Rajveer could see the marks on their wrists, red abrasions that told stories they did not have to explain. One girl's sandals were missing. Another's abaya was torn along the hem as if she had been running. Their bodies trembled not just from thirst, but from the remnants of terror that had not yet faded. Whatever had brought them here, it had not been voluntary. He tried speaking slowly in English, mixing in the few Arabic words he'd learned. "Help, car broken," he said, gesturing back toward the road. "You here. Why?" He pointed at the sand, then mimed running. The leader, the same girl who had taken the bottle first, hesitated, then lifted her hands to mimic chains. She pointed over the dunes and spat out a word he didn't understand, but her tone made its meaning clear. Someone dangerous was out there. Rajveer felt a cold pulse run through him despite the heat. This wasn't just a coincidence. They weren't lost tourists like him. They were hiding. For a long moment, they studied each other in silence. He saw the calculation in their eyes. Could they trust this foreigner stranded and alone, or was he another threat in a world that had already betrayed them? He knew he didn't look like a rescuer. Dust streaked his shirt, his hair clung damply to his forehead, and worry had sharpened his features into unfamiliar lines. But he also knew leaving them here meant condemning them to whatever danger lay beyond the dunes. "We go," he said finally, pointing back to the road. "Together." The girl's brow furrowed. She glanced at her companions, then at the horizon. For a heartbeat, the decision hung in the air like the stillness before a storm. Then she nodded once, firm and quick, and motioned for the others to follow. As they walked back toward the stranded jeep, The sun dipped lower, painting the desert in bruised purples and gold. Shadows stretched long, curling around their feet like restless spirits. Rajveer felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders, heavier than his backpack, heavier than the heat. He didn't know who these girls were or what kind of danger had driven them into hiding, but he knew one thing with certainty. Their fates had just become entwined with his. And whatever waited beyond the horizon, it was coming closer with every passing second. By the time they reached the jeep, the last sliver of sunlight had disappeared, leaving only the cool breath of the night and a growing sense of urgency. The desert no longer felt empty. It felt like it was holding its breath. The night settled quickly, wrapping the desert in a cool, deceptive calm. Stars spilled across the sky in brilliant clusters, their cold light reflecting off the dunes like scattered shards of glass. Rajveer crouched beside the jeep's open hood, the beam of his flashlight trembling slightly as his tired hands fumbled with the engine. The 5 girls sat a few steps away, close enough to the vehicle to feel some measure of safety, yet distant enough to keep their guarded eyes on him. Their whispered Arabic drifted through the still air. Soft, clipped exchanges layered with tension he didn't need a translator to understand. He wiped his greasy hands on his shirt and tried to focus. If he couldn't get the jeep running, they were stranded until morning, and something in the way the girls kept glancing toward the horizon told him that waiting wasn't an option. The engine had overheated, but it wasn't beyond repair. He just needed time and steady hands. Both were slipping away. When he glanced up, the leader met his gaze. Her posture was straight despite her exhaustion, chin lifted with a kind of defiant poise. She didn't flinch when he approached, but her companions instinctively drew closer together, like a flock tightening against a gust of wind. Rajveer crouched in front of her, lowering his voice to something between reassurance and urgency. "Car will work. Soon," he said, gesturing toward the jeep, then to the surrounding darkness. "But danger." He pointed to the horizon. "Who?" She hesitated, chewing at her cracked lower lip. Then, slowly, she traced a shape in the sand. A square, then lines that suggested walls. A compound. She mimed guards with guns, then shackles around wrists. Her eyes hardened as she looked at him, and she shook her head as if to say there was no returning. The others nodded grimly. Rajveer's stomach tightened. He didn't need the full story to understand they had escaped something brutal, and whoever they'd run from wouldn't simply let them vanish into the desert. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a faint hum. It was distant but unmistakable, the low, rolling growl of an engine. Every head turned in unison toward the sound. The girls froze, their whispers cut off mid-breath. Rajveer extinguished his flashlight instinctively and strained to listen. There it was again, faint but growing. Someone else was out there, moving across the desert roads. His pulse quickened. He motioned for them to stay quiet and ducked behind the jeep. The headlights appeared moments later, a pair of pale orbs gliding slowly across the dunes, sweeping in arcs as if searching. A truck, by the looks of its silhouette, moving steadily in their direction. Rajveer's mind raced. If it was a patrol, they might be safe, but the girls' terrified expressions told him otherwise. They recognized the sound. He slid back to the engine, his hands working faster now, driven by a sudden clarity. The girls clustered behind the jeep, crouched low, their breathing shallow and uneven. One of them silently clutched a small pendant at her neck as if praying. The leader knelt beside Rajveer without warning, startling him. She didn't speak, but she held the flashlight steady for him, her hands surprisingly firm despite their trembling. For a brief second, their eyes met. He saw fear there, yes, but also trust, reluctant, fragile but real. The truck's lights grew brighter, carving harsh paths through the darkness. Rajveer twisted a final bolt, slammed the hood down, and leapt into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and fell silent. Panic clawed at his chest. He tried again, whispering a desperate plea through clenched teeth. The engine caught this time, reluctantly, as if waking from a heavy sleep. "Get in," he hissed, waving frantically. The girls piled into the jeep with astonishing speed, their earlier caution swept away by instinct. Rajveer threw the vehicle into gear and pressed the accelerator, feeling the tires struggle against loose sand before finally finding grip. The jeep lurched forward, picking up speed just as the truck crested the nearest dune. Shouts echoed faintly behind them. Someone had seen them. The truck's headlights locked on like predators' eyes, and its engine roared as it accelerated. Rajveer's heartbeat pounded in rhythm with the rattling of the jeep, every bump threatening to throw them off balance. He kept his eyes fixed on the vague line of the road ahead, barely visible in the starlight. The girls clung to the seats, silent now, their terror compressed into white-knuckled grips. The truck gained on them quickly. It was larger, faster, built for this terrain. Rajveer's mind flicked through options, most of them useless. They couldn't outrun it for long. The jeep was too old, the road too unpredictable. He spotted a narrow canyon-like cut between two ridges ahead, a dry wadi that twisted like a snake. It was risky, but it might buy them time. He veered sharply, tires skidding as sand sprayed into the night. The jeep plunged into the wadi, bouncing violently over uneven ground. Behind them, the truck followed, but its heavier frame struggled with the tight turns. For a few precious moments, the canyon walls shielded them from the truck's lights. Rajveer slowed just enough to keep control, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles blanched. The leader looked back through the rear window, her breath fogging the glass. The truck's lights flickered in and out of view like distant lightning. Then, suddenly, silence. No more engine. No more headlights. Just the soft hiss of the desert wind swirling through the canyon. Rajveer pulled the jeep to a stop, killed the lights, and let the engine idle quietly. The girls didn't speak, but their eyes mirrored his question. Had they lost them, or were they being hunted with more patience than he could imagine? The night pressed in around them, heavy and watchful. Rajveer exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to unclench from the steering wheel. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. But for the first time since the encounter began, they had a sliver of distance, a fragile pause. And in that narrow canyon, under a sky littered with indifferent stars, a silent promise formed between strangers who had no choice but to trust each other if they were to survive what was coming.